The marble courtroom was so quiet you could almost hear people breathing. Every head turned toward Judge Amy Coney Barrett as she leaned forward, her black robe heavy against the polished bench. For years, she had been seen as unshakable, calm, disciplined, the picture of authority. But on this day, something was different. Her eyes locked onto Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, standing tall in a burgundy blazer at the defense table. And then, with a voice sharp enough to slice through stone, Barrett broke the silence. "Judge Barrett, Congresswoman, your record shows a pattern of disrespect for constitutional law that frankly disgusts me." The gallery gasped. Lawyers froze. Even the court reporter hesitated, unsure if she had heard correctly. Judges weren't supposed to talk like this. They weren't supposed to show personal anger. But Barrett wasn't finished. "Judge Barrett, you've spent your entire career undermining the very foundations this court represents. And now you stand here, expecting mercy." Whispers spread through the room. The prosecution smiled, convinced this trial was already over before it even began. Crockett's team looked shaken, their pens scratching nervously across notepads. And yet, through the storm, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't lower her head. Instead, a faint smile spread across her face, steady and controlled. It wasn't the smile of someone defeated. It was the smile of someone who knew a secret. A smile that said she was ready for this moment, no matter how brutal it became. In that instant, the balance of the courtroom shifted. Nobody knew it yet, but what was about to unfold would turn a simple trial into a clash that would shake the legal world and capture the attention of millions far beyond those marble walls. The silence after Barrett's words didn't last long. A low murmur rippled through the courtroom, like distant thunder before a storm. But Judge Barrett was just getting started. "Judge Barrett, Congresswoman, you've treated the Constitution like a suggestion rather than the law of this land. You've mocked it in interviews, ignored it in speeches, and voted against its principles time and time again. And yet you stand here today, asking this court for respect? I don't think so." The blow landed hard. Crockett's lead attorney, Marcus Williams, quickly stood. "Williams, objection, Your Honor. With all respect, these are personal attacks, not legal arguments." Barrett's gavel slammed down so loud it made several people in the gallery jump. "Judge Barrett, sit down, counsel. I wasn't speaking to you." Williams froze, his face pale. He slowly lowered himself back into his chair, his hand trembling slightly as he placed his pen down. The prosecution team exchanged quiet smiles. They had expected a fight, but what they were witnessing was a public dismantling before their case had even been presented. Barrett leaned forward again, her voice now sharper, more personal. "Judge Barrett, Congresswoman Crockett, your record in Congress is riddled with attempts to weaken constitutional protections. 17 times, you've voted against proposed amendments that would have strengthened this nation's founding principles. 17. And let's not forget your public statements." She reached into a folder on her desk and pulled out a printed page. Holding it high, she read it aloud. "Judge Barrett, quote, the Constitution is outdated and needs to be reimagined for modern times." That was you, Congresswoman, on national television. Do you deny it? The gallery erupted into whispers. Reporters scribbled frantically. Crockett stood tall, hands clasped behind her back, and gave a steady nod. "Crockett, I said those words, Your Honor. And I stand by them." Barrett's eyes narrowed. "Judge Barrett, so you admit your contempt for the very document that gives this court its authority?" The tension in the room grew thick. Even the air felt heavy, pressing down on every spectator. Outside, protesters were chanting louder now, their voices seeping faintly through the walls. On one side, signs read "Protect the Constitution." On the other, "Voting rights are human rights." Inside, Barrett pressed harder. "Judge Barrett, you've called for packing the courts with liberal judges. You've defended lawless behavior in our cities. You've insulted this very institution by calling us partisan hacks. And now, you want me to believe your case is built on principle." She slammed the papers down, her gavel following like a gunshot. "Judge Barrett, Congresswoman, you don't deserve to stand in this courtroom." Gasps echoed from the gallery. Some supporters of Crockett buried their faces in their hands, unable to watch. Others glared at Barrett in outrage. Legal observers exchanged nervous glances, whispering that they had never seen a judge so openly hostile. Marcus Williams leaned toward Crockett, whispering urgently. "Williams, whispering Jasmine, don't push back. She's baiting you." But Crockett didn't move. She stood straight, her calm eyes never leaving Barrett's. The prosecution's lead attorney, David Morrison, finally rose from his seat, his expression smug. "Morrison, Your Honor, I think it's clear what's happening here. This so-called case is nothing but political theater. Congresswoman Crockett is here to make headlines, not arguments. The state stands ready to prove these voting laws are constitutional, but I suspect we won't need to. She's destroying her own credibility quite well. Laughter erupted from a small group of Barrett's supporters in the gallery, but it was quickly silenced by Barrett's glare. Still, Morrison's words hung in the air. Crockett was being painted as a fraud, a politician hungry for attention rather than a defender of rights. Barrett pressed the attack. She pulled out another stack of papers, printouts of Crockett's social media posts. Judge Barrett, here we are. Post after post, mocking this court. Calling us partisan. Calling us out of touch. This isn't just criticism, it's contempt. You've treated the highest court in this land like a political punching bag. And now you want to stand before me and argue about constitutional law. She waved the papers in the air before dropping them onto the bench with disdain. Judge Barrett, tell me, Congresswoman, do you understand the gravity of what you're doing? Do you understand that you're asking me to overturn duly passed legislation simply because you don't like it? The gallery buzzed with whispers. A veteran court reporter muttered under her breath, I've never seen anything like this. Crockett finally spoke, her voice calm but carrying through the chamber. Crockett, Your Honor, I understand the law better than you might think. The room froze. Barrett's eyebrows shot up, her face tightening in disbelief. Judge Barrett, excuse me. Crockett, I said, I understand the law, Your Honor. Perhaps better than some judges who confuse personal beliefs with constitutional interpretation. The entire courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Williams tugged at Crockett's sleeve, whispering frantically. Williams, whispering, stop. Please. You'll be held in contempt. Barrett's face flushed crimson. Judge Barrett, you will show proper respect in my courtroom, Congresswoman, or I will hold you in contempt immediately. But Crockett's voice didn't waver. Crockett, I show respect to the law, Your Honor. The question is, does this court? The words cut through the air like a knife. The gallery buzzed louder, people turning to one another in shock. Reporters' pens flew across their notepads. Barrett's hand shook slightly as she grabbed her gavel again, but she hesitated before striking it. She leaned forward, her voice dropping lower but laced with venom. Judge Barrett, perhaps if you spent more time studying constitutional law instead of chasing cameras and applause, you'd understand how flawed your arguments are. A hush fell over the room. That was the moment. Barrett had not only attacked Crockett's politics, she had questioned her intelligence, her very right to stand there. Crockett's faint smile returned. The same quiet, knowing smile from before. Williams noticed it immediately. His nervous energy eased for the first time, and he leaned back, realizing something had shifted. The prosecution, however, still smirked, convinced Barrett's attack had left Crockett cornered. But Crockett wasn't cornered at all. She had been waiting patiently for exactly this. The murmurs in the courtroom grew into a storm. Activists outside were demanding someone live-stream the proceedings, though recording devices were banned. Social media lit up with messages from those inside, Barrett going off on Crockett, unprecedented hostility, courtroom chaos. What had begun as a trial was now a spectacle, a showdown between tradition and defiance, power and resistance. Barrett thought she had broken her opponent. What she didn't realize was that Jasmine Crockett was just getting started. The air inside the courtroom felt different now. The attacks had been relentless, the humiliation public, and the weight of the judge's authority seemed impossible to resist. But Jasmine Crockett didn't look defeated. She didn't even look rattled. She stood tall, that small smile never leaving her face. And then, slowly, deliberately, she reached for her briefcase. Every eye in the room followed her hand. The click of the latches echoed like a drumbeat. Crockett opened it calmly, pulling out a thick leather folder. She didn't fumble. She didn't rush. She moved like someone who had rehearsed this moment 100 times. Marcus Williams, her attorney, straightened in his chair. He recognized the shift immediately. The fear in his eyes gave way to something else, anticipation. Crockett laid the folder on the table, opened it, and pulled out the first document. She held it up for the room to see. Crockett, Your Honor, since you've questioned my understanding of constitutional law, perhaps it's time we look at some facts. Barrett's eyes narrowed, but her expression betrayed a flicker of unease. Judge Barrett, proceed. Crockett stepped forward. Crockett, this is your dissenting opinion from the Johnson case, just last year. In that opinion, you argued that the Fourth Amendment doesn't apply to digital communications. You wrote, and I quote, We cannot extend 18th century protections to 21st century problems without clear legislative guidance. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Barrett shifted in her chair, her fingers drumming nervously against the bench. Crockett, but here she pulled out another document with the smooth precision of a magician revealing the next card in a trick, is a letter you wrote to the Constitutional Law Quarterly in 2019. In that letter, you argued the exact opposite. You said constitutional principles must evolve with technology, and that originalist interpretation requires understanding the spirit, not just the letter of the law. Your words, Judge. Not mine. The silence was electric. Reporters scribbled furiously, some shaking their heads in disbelief. Barrett's reputation had always been built on consistency, discipline, control. But now, in black and white, Crockett was tearing that foundation apart. Barrett's lips tightened. Judge Barrett, judicial opinions can evolve based on case specifics. Crockett didn't back down. Crockett, or maybe Your Honor, they evolve depending on which way the politics lean. The gallery erupted in whispers, some gasping, others nodding in agreement. Barrett slammed her gavel, but the noise barely cut through the tension. Crockett pulled out a third document, this one stamped with official congressional seals. Crockett, and here, your confirmation hearing transcript. Senator Martinez asked you about voting rights. You said, and I quote, "The Constitution guarantees all Americans equal access to the ballot, and any law that creates unnecessary barriers deserves the strictest scrutiny from federal courts." Your words, Judge. Clear as day. She placed the transcript on the table and then held up another document. Crockett, but 6 months ago, in your ruling on the Pennsylvania case, you wrote that states have broad discretion to regulate voting procedures, and courts should show maximum deference to legislatures. That's not judicial evolution. That's contradiction. That's bias. Barrett's face flushed. Her hands gripped the bench so tightly her knuckles turned white. The prosecution team shifted uneasily, their earlier confidence unraveling. Crockett wasn't finished. She reached deeper into the folder and pulled out the most dangerous evidence yet. Crockett, and then there's this. She held up a transcript marked with multiple seals of authentication. Crockett, your private speech at the Heritage Foundation. After taking your oath of impartiality, you told that audience, sometimes judges must be willing to set aside precedent when the future of traditional American values is at stake. Those were your words, Judge. Spoken behind closed doors. Words that sound a lot more like politics than justice. The courtroom exploded in gasps. Even Barrett's most loyal supporters looked shaken. Barrett leaned forward, her face pale, her voice trembling slightly. Judge Barrett, that was a private event. Out of context. Crockett, out of context? Or out of line? The tension was unbearable. The prosecution team looked like they'd swallowed glass. Williams leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on Crockett with awe. He had seen her fight before, but never like this. Crockett stepped closer to the bench, her voice steady, her words cutting like steel. Crockett, Your Honor, you've spent this entire hearing questioning my qualifications, my intelligence, my right to stand here. You've accused me of disrespecting the Constitution. But what I understand better than you is that the Constitution isn't a weapon for political convenience. It's a promise. A promise that judges must interpret it with impartiality, not bend it to fit their personal beliefs. The gallery erupted into applause before being hushed again. Barrett raised her gavel, but her hand shook so violently she didn't strike it. Crockett wasn't done. She pulled out one final paper, holding it high. Crockett, this is a legal brief I co-authored in law school. My professor called it brilliant, required reading for federal judges. That professor's name is Justice Elena Kagan. She sits on the highest court of this nation. So when you question my qualifications, Judge Barrett, remember that one of your colleagues, a Supreme Court justice, once believed I was more than qualified. Chaos erupted. Reporters typed like machine guns, the sound of clicking keys filling the air. Supporters in the gallery gasped, some even cheering despite court rules. Barrett sat frozen, her face drained of color. Crockett walked to the center of the room, her voice calm but thunderous. Crockett, Your Honor, you've called me unfit. You've suggested I don't belong here. But the truth is this, the only person in this courtroom who has proven themselves unqualified to interpret constitutional law, unfit to sit in judgment of others, and lacking the temperament for this position is you. The room exploded. Half the gallery burst into applause, the other half sat stunned in silence. Reporters raised their phones, capturing the moment even without cameras allowed. The hashtag began trending instantly, #CrocketDestroysBarrett. Barrett slammed her gavel over and over, shouting for order, but her voice was drowned out by the chaos. For the first time in her career, she looked powerless. The authority she had carried into the room was gone, stripped away not by law, but by truth. Jasmine Crockett stood tall in the center of the courtroom, calm, steady, knowing she had just flipped the trial upside down. The gavel kept slamming, but it didn't matter anymore. The courtroom was already lost to chaos. Judge Barrett, once seen as unshakable, sat pale and rattled, her authority stripped away in front of the nation. Crockett, calm and unflinching, stood in the center of the storm like she had always known this day would come. Within minutes, the outside world erupted. As the doors opened, the sound of protesters filled the air, chants, cheers, and angry shouts all blending together into one roar. Reporters sprinted down the courthouse steps, microphones shaking in their hands as they shouted updates into cameras. Satellite trucks lined the street. What had started as a courtroom battle was now a national event. On social media, the explosion was instant. Hashtags trended worldwide, hashtag Crockett destroys Barrett, hashtag Courtroom Showdown, hashtag Justice on Trial. The clip of Crockett's final line, "The only person unfit here is you," spread across platforms, racking up millions of views within hours. For young activists, it was a rallying cry. For legal scholars, it was a moment of reckoning. For Barrett supporters, it was a nightmare. News networks cut into regular programming to air live coverage. Commentators struggled to find the words, calling it historic, unprecedented, and a cultural earthquake. Panels of legal experts replayed Crockett's evidence, pointing out the contradictions in Barrett's record. Some even questioned if Barrett could remain on the bench at all. Meanwhile, celebrations broke out across the country. Watch parties that had gathered to monitor the trial erupted in cheers when Crockett's comeback hit the airwaves. Videos showed people jumping to their feet, clapping, hugging, chanting her name. Law students called it a masterclass in courtroom strategy. Community leaders praised her courage. Even some of her past critics admitted they had underestimated her. For Barrett, the fallout was devastating. Overnight, her reputation as a calm, disciplined judge was shattered. Headlines read, "Barrett exposed, judicial bias on display, Crockett turns trial into history." Conservative allies scrambled to defend her, but their words fell flat against the evidence Crockett had laid out. The speech at the Heritage Foundation became the centerpiece of a growing ethics scandal. Calls for an official investigation spread. 3 days later, Barrett released a carefully worded statement. She admitted her tone in the courtroom had been regrettable, and insisted her commitment to impartiality remained intact. But she didn't apologize to Crockett. And it didn't matter. The damage was done. Her authority had cracked in front of the world, and no statement could glue it back together. For Jasmine Crockett, the confrontation changed everything. She was no longer just a congresswoman from Texas. She became a symbol of defiance, of standing up to unchecked power. Her approval soared. Party leaders who once thought she was too combative now called her exactly the kind of fighter they needed. Invitations poured in for interviews, speeches, and appearances. But Crockett didn't stop at victory. She announced new plans for judicial accountability reforms, ethics training for federal judges, independent oversight for misconduct, stronger protections against bias on the bench. Ideas that might have been ignored just weeks before now gained traction, fueled by the fire of her performance. This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a turning point. A cultural moment that forced Americans to look at their courts in a new way. The image of Barrett's authority collapsing under the weight of her own contradictions, and Crockett rising stronger with every word, was burned into the public mind. And as the dust settled, one truth became impossible to ignore: even the highest judges are not untouchable. Power can be challenged. Authority can be broken. And when someone stands tall, prepared, and unafraid, even the mightiest gavel can fall silent.